Yeah, hi, good morning. My name is Eric Goldman. I'm a professor at Santa Clara University School of Law. I'm thrilled to extend my greetings to all of you for being here today. Before we get started, I just do want to say thanks to Kate for her efforts organizing this along with her St. John's team. As many of you know, conferences like this are supposed to look like they were easy. You're not supposed to see all the stuff that takes place in the background, but it is an undertaking of substantial import, and so we're certainly grateful for her work. I want to thank all of you for being here today and being a part of this conversation. There's a community of people interested in this topic, and having a chance for us to get together and see each other face to face is a real delight. And I want to say thanks to our speakers, especially the speakers on today's panel, because especially on today's panel, it's a significant decision on the part of companies to come and actually talk about what they're doing. There are a lot of questions about exactly what's taking place under the hood. And we now know that members of Congress are quite interested in that topic, and members of the press are interested in the topic. And so the more transparency we get, I think the better we all are, but it doesn't come for free. And so I want to thank the speakers for doing that. Today's panel is going to be a chance for us to get a little bit of a closer look under the hood at exactly how three of the major internet companies are handling content moderation topics. And so to help us with that, we have representatives from Google, Facebook, and Twitter to talk about it and share their insights. To my left is Peter Stern from Facebook, who spoke at the prior conference in DC. To his left is Nora Puckett from Google, who has spoken at both of our conferences, yeah?
Yep.
And to her left is Jarrell Peterson from Twitter, who's a newcomer to this particular stage, and we're grateful for him to do that. I don't know, do we have an order for how we're going to proceed? Peter, you're listed first. I think we're going to turn the stage over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm Peter Stern on the product policy team with Facebook in Menlo Park. And my goal today will be to give you an overview of the principles that guide our content policies, talk to you about the process that we use to develop those policies, and then to go into some of the details that Eric talked about in the under the hood vein to try and help people understand how we approach some of these important issues of content moderation. I'm grateful to Kate for getting all this together. I second the thanks and note of admiration. It's not easy by any means. And it was so interesting for me to sit in the room and listen to the prior panel. I don't actually often get to hear a conversation like that. And it was just fascinating and kind of caused me to reflect on, I've been at Facebook for a little over 4 years now. I joined in 2011. As somebody who was a corporate lawyer, a litigator who had, with an IP background, but who had focused on issues of corporate social responsibility and user trust for a number of years. I spent about 8 years litigating alien tort statute cases, for those of you who remember that area of the law, and wanted to move into a new pasture, and through a combination of circumstances ended up on the product policy team. So I'm from the second generation, maybe even the third generation of people involved in this field. And when I look at then versus now, it's really quite instructive, and maybe in some ways kind of foreshadows some of the remarks that I would make. When I joined, I think there were definitely fewer than 15 people on our team worldwide, and now there are at least 70. So there's been a significant expansion of the team and a globalization of the team. We had community standards. There was a narrower public version, and then there were more details. As Kate mentioned, those two have now been merged, and everything is public. I think Dave Wilner and others may not have been giving themselves quite enough credit, in the sense that we definitely had rules and not mere standards. But I think if you compare then and now, you might say that what existed back then was kind of like the chassis. that we use today, and now it's been built out in a bunch of different important directions, and we have made much greater use of automation, and we've formalized and drawn out and articulated better, I think, many of the principles at issue, which has been helpful and leaves us still with a long way to go. So with that as kind of a personal note and background, let me kind of dive in here. A lot of the work of content moderation for us begins with our company mission, which is to build community and bring the world closer together. And that really points us in the direction of a couple of key principles that I want to set out just at the outset, because they inform a lot of what we're doing. The first is an emphasis on safety. We want people to feel safe when they come to the platform, and we're committed to removing content that encourages real-world harm. This is extremely important to us, and we have a large team devoted to this, which I'll say something about. A second principle is voice. Free expression, allowing people, including from groups and perspectives that might not otherwise be heard, to have a voice on the platform is incredibly important to us. We have a bias towards letting people talk up until it reaches a point where we see the possible causation of harm out in the world, and then we draw the line and we enforce our policies and we will remove content. So safety and voice are absolutely critical. And then there's a big focus that runs throughout the policies on equity. And that means having a system that people view as legitimate and basically fair, even when they don't agree with any individual decision that we've made, is extremely important. And it also means that sometimes we are, if there's a gray area, if there is a result that doesn't feel quite right to us, we'll turn to what we call the spirit of the policy and make a call that takes us to the place that we think is more consistent with the principles behind our policies, even if the actual chapter and verse are not clear. So equity is also extremely important. With that as background, let me try to say a bit about how we approach policy development. There are a couple of different phases here. And when I say policy development, I'm talking about the continued articulation, expansion, refining of our community standards. The ads policies too, but mostly I'm going to be talking about the community standards. We run a process that kind of begins with an idea, an input from an outside group. From within Facebook, the enforcement arm tells us, this is not working well. We're seeing that such and such is not getting caught. Such and such we think should be caught is not getting caught. We need to tweak the rule. Sometimes policy leaders, thought leaders, people in this room will tell us, you're not in the right place. You need to take a look at this. And so we kick off a process that will see us through a policy analysis. And a lot of this focuses around what we call our Content Standards Forum, which is a biweekly meeting that we run to both announce the initiation of this process and to really finalize a consensus and recommendation. So once the idea comes in the pipeline, we will, in some cases, start testing. We'll talk to internal groups, and also, very importantly, we'll start talking to outside groups. I specifically run what we call a stakeholder engagement team, which is responsible for ensuring that for all changes coming through the Community Standards Forum process, we have significant, relevant, diverse, global input on our policies from groups out in the world. Now, sourcing those types of input is not necessarily a straightforward or easy matter. We talk to many prominent groups around the world. We also try to go local as much as we can to get voices that are close to the ground, because we realize what matters most is how the rules are going to impact users, and we want to hear those voices. And we could really have a whole other separate conversation about this, but I would challenge you all to think hard and help me to think hard, candidly, about what is the best way for us to be seeking and obtaining that input with a user base of over 2 billion people. It's not an easy proposition. It's something that we're very focused on right now. That's improving, and we want to continue to improve it. So after we bring together these sources of input, we have a series of working groups that refine the policy and that ultimately will lay out options and make a recommendation that gets vetted by members of the overall team and the leadership. After that, we will formally adopt the recommendation, and there's a series of steps that are necessary to implement it, launch it. This could involve the preparation of tools, the refinement of tools, training of reviewers, the education. That's why there's always something of a lag between the adoption of a new policy and the actual going live date, because we need to make sure that the reviewers are given very granular information about this. And then after the rule goes live, we may conduct testing, do samples so that we're putting content that we know should be caught, for example, through the process to see if it's caught or vice versa. And if we're not getting the results we want, then we'll go back and refine that. So that's kind of the sequence from the initial idea until a policy goes live. Now let me, and Eric, if I'm using too much time, feel free to cut me off. Okay. Let me dive in now to the actual process itself, the process of content moderation that is the focus of today's conference. And so I'm going to be now broadening the perspective beyond the product policy team to deal with some other very significant elements of our organization. One is what we call community operations. That's the enforcement arm, if you will. It sits outside policy. It's the group that is responsible for managing, training all of the reviewers, and for working on the process that actually enforces our policies. There's also another very important part of the overall company called community integrity that is responsible for building the tools that are used to enforce the policies, and also the tools that assist reviewers when they sit down at their desk. What kind of a setup do they see? How much context is available to them? That's a very important continuing process, and community integrity handles that. So our basic approach is content comes to our attention through a variety of ways, which I'll say something about. We evaluate it under our policies. If it violates our policies, we remove it. If it doesn't, then we leave it up. That's sort of the fundamental decision tree involved. For any given reviewer, and we receive millions of reports each week, which we are able to handle generally within a 24-hour time frame. When a reviewer is sitting there and identifies content that does violate our policies, and all the reviewers are educated in all the policies, so there is some particular specialization, but by and large, all the reviewers will have all of the policies in mind and are responsible for enforcing all of them. If a policy is violated, they will then take the further step of labeling what they see under a series of headings, which doesn't involve the prioritization or the result, whether it stays up or comes down, but it helps us to track what's going on. It helps us to prepare numbers that we are able to release, and just basically to get a better sense of what's going on the platform, which is very important. When you now see us releasing numbers about the volume of content that is removed in certain categories, that's a result of the labeling that we've now been able to do. And the transparency goes along with the labeling, so that's really important. We use automation in a number of different ways. At this stage, the thing to focus on is that we have tools that help us route certain types of reports to reviewers to get high-pry attention. If it relates to safety or terrorism, we're going to ensure that automation will help to get those looked at as fast as possible. We also use automation to make the overall process more efficient. If we're getting thousands of reports of a particular piece of content, we may reach a point where automation will help us determine that we're sure that this doesn't violate. We're not going to keep reviewing it. And so we'll shield that piece of content to make the process more streamlined overall. That's kind of the basic framework of the steps that we take in doing the review. Let me say a quick word about the reviewers, because they're a very important part of the process, and we spend a lot of time focusing on how to support them, how to ensure that they can do their job as well as possible. If you add together all of the people who are involved in safety and security at Facebook, that involves preparing tools, looking at content, in some cases working with law enforcement. That number by the end of this year will be about 20,000. That's a significant increase over the past year. And so that's an area where we've been really placing greater and greater focus in terms of detecting fake accounts, identifying certain types of inauthentic behavior, as well as more traditional concerns such as child safety and bullying harassment. We use a mix of full-time employees, contractors, and employees of partner companies to help with the content review. That takes place 24/7 in over 50 languages around the world. I think the thing to emphasize in terms of the reviewers is really three things. One is we try very hard to ensure that they have proper language capability so that they have the most sophisticated possible understanding of the content that they're seeing. That involves just the language, obviously, but in addition, necessary context and background that would be useful to a sophisticated understanding of the content. The second thing is support. We take the issue of resiliency very seriously and ensure that all of the reviewers who are looking at content have psychological support, psychological counseling services made available to them. They know about this from the time that they start with the company. We insist that the companies that we contract with build this into to the mechanism. And so we know that this is an issue and we try to deal with it. And then the other thing, which I mentioned briefly, is training. Training is incredibly important. We want reviewers applying that standard of, if it makes me feel not good, then I'm going to take it down. That would be definitely a failure of the process for us. We try to make it as mechanical, as non-discretionary as possible, so that the reviewers have clear guidance. Of course, they can kick questions back up their own internal chain, but we don't want them to be making their own decisions. We want them to be enforcing our policies. How am I doing? Okay. I don't want to use up all the time. I guess the other thing that I would focus on is two items. Automation. I mentioned the usefulness of automation in the overall process. It would also be very important to talk about how we use automation in terms of certain types of content identification and removal in a broader sense. And here I think there probably is a significant difference from the Dave Wilner days. Outside of something like child exploitative imagery, there's a much greater reliance on automation. I think there's going to continue to be a greater reliance on automation because it helps us accomplish our fundamental goal, which is to remove content from the platform that violates our policies. If it's on the platform or violates our policies, we don't want it to be on the platform. And ideally, we would like to remove it before anybody has to see it and report it to us. So in the areas of nudity, spam, that's relatively speaking low-hanging fruit, and we're able to build classifiers to identify that and in many cases remove that. Once we've identified it and then it comes up again, we can remove that. Other areas are much trickier. Hate speech, for example. We have make use of classifiers that identify hate speech, but they don't remove it. They typically flag it for humans to review, so that we don't make mistakes, or we don't make as many. Hopefully we don't make more mistakes than we have to when it comes to very contextually bound decisions. You know, if we see a photo of an ISIS flag, okay, that tells us there may be something going on, but it could be counter speech, it could be part of a news report. We're not going to remove that because that could take us in the wrong direction. So this is an example of how we try to come up with an effective marriage of automation and human review to enforce our policies in an effective way. The last thing I want to talk about is appeals. This is part of the overall focus on transparency and user control that we have really been building out over the past year. In the past, appeals were limited to removal of profiles, pages, and groups. When we rolled out the more detailed, full version of our community standards this spring, we also made it possible for people whose content had been removed to appeal that decision in certain categories: hate speech, graphic violence, and nudity. We're now very shortly going to be extending the categories under which appeals are possible to terrorism and bullying. And we're also working hard, although we have not yet completed a system for reporting on the part of people who reported someone else's content and they didn't get the result that they wanted, and they want to bring that to our attention. I think this violates. You told me it doesn't. I'd like someone to take a second look at that. We're going to be building that system out. So I'll stop there. There's more that could be said, but I hope I've given you an overview of how we approach content moderation.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's terrific. Nora, we'll turn to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nora Puckett. I'm on the litigation team at Google. And one thing that makes us a little bit different, perhaps, than Twitter and Facebook are just the number of products that we have at Google. So that includes things like search, but it includes Gmail, our ads products, YouTube, which we heard about earlier today, Blogger. So there's really a number of products, each of which have their own policies according to what the product does. And at Google, content moderation falls into mainly two categories, at least in my mind, which are legal removals, and that is more of a cross-product issue. And those are instances in which governments or users reach out to us and ask us to remove content that they feel violates applicable local law. The other side of content moderation comes in the form of our content policies, again, which vary depending on which product you're talking about. And these are the policies that we set for our products that speak to what kinds of content we do and we don't want on our platforms. And these include things like hate speech, harassment content, terrorist content. And we enforce these policies, but we also respond quickly to notices from users informing us that they think that certain content might violate our policies. So I thought I'd start about talking about legal removals, again, because it is more cross-product, and then talk about some of our content policies particularly. And so in terms of legal removals, like I said, it's instances in which we get notices from users or the government saying that I think this particular piece of content on this particular product violates an applicable local law. And when we get one of those requests and ultimately decide that it meets the criteria for doing a legal removal, and that is dependent on the specific nature of the request as well as the applicable local law, then we generally do a removal in the local jurisdiction where the complaint is coming from and where the law is being violated. There are some instances in which we do global removals, for example, for copyright infringing content and child sexual exploitation imagery. And also we are doing, so those are the instances in which we're generally speaking doing a global removal. And I think a good way to kind of understand the policy is to kind of understand how the process generally works. And so when you are someone who is requesting that you do a legal removal, the best way for you to do that is to go to our legal removals web form. And that's going to take you through a series of questions so you get a better understanding of, so we get a better understanding of what it is that you're complaining about. So the first question it asks is, what product are you talking about? Once we've asked you what product, is it Blogger, is it YouTube, we then try to make sure that what you're talking about is a legal removal as opposed to some other kind of a request. So you're not complaining about a content policy, which will be handled by different people. You're not just saying that you've lost your Gmail password and you need help recovering it. We want to make sure that you're getting to the right people so that we handle it as expeditiously as possible. So once we've gotten through those stages, then we try to identify what kind of legal issue you're concerned about. So that might be, are you worried about copyright infringing content? We're going to get you to the people that handle DMCA type requests. Are you a European user and you're asking us to delist things from search because you feel like they're no longer accurate or relevant or somehow they're excessive? We're going to get you to the people who are handling the European privacy removals since the 2014 Castella decision. So finally, if we get to the point where we think that we should be doing a legal removal, and in the US we usually voluntarily comply with court orders, then we may do the removal and remove it in the local jurisdiction with the exception, as I noted, of copyright infringing content and child sexual exploitation imagery. Once we do the removal, generally speaking, we report that to Lumen, which is our partnership with the Berkman Center. We also report a lot of these statistics on our transparency report. And I think our transparency report has been around since possibly 2010. And it keeps on expanding year by year. So I think now you can get information about government removal requests, copyright removal requests, as well as Casteja-related right-to-be-forgotten type requests. The people that are working on these teams are trying to strike a really delicate but important balance between taking into account the concerns of the requesters who are asking us to remove the content, taking into account what the actual laws are that they are saying should apply and should result in a removal occurring, with the equally important issues of freedom of speech, political speech, and other issues. So it's definitely a tough balance that they're trying to reach. Another tough part of it is just the operational concern, which is the scale at which we're talking about. So just by way of example, since 2014, when the Casteja decision came into effect, I think we've gotten requests to remove something like 2.8 million URLs. And we've removed something a little bit over 1 million of those URLs at that time. So each of those 2.8 million requests have to be assessed carefully, and we're obviously making the decision to remove some according to law, but others we're not actually doing the delisting because we don't think it meets the criteria. I think since we've been keeping some of these statistics, we've had requests for 3.8 billion URLs to be removed because people think that they're violating various copyright laws. So it's a pretty significant number that we're talking about. But obviously the teams are working hard to get it done right. The other important thing to note about the legal removals team is that we are constantly training these people. And we're doing that in different ways, like updating them on what the policies are. When there are changes in the law, as we had to quickly pivot when the Casteja decision came down to try to explain how to apply those criteria carefully and thoughtfully. But also just doing things like having other, doing like blind tests or having people, do second reviews to make sure that we're getting these things done correctly. So that's kind of the legal removals side of the house. The other part of it are our content policies. And like I said, those run the spectrum according to what product you're talking about. And on the one end of that spectrum is something like search. Now, search is supposed to be an index of the web, but we nevertheless do have policies. Like I said, we do delist for copyright infringing content and for child sexual exploitation imagery. Obviously, in Europe, we're also doing so in accordance with the right to be forgotten. But we also have webmaster guidelines. And so those are things that are dealing with more scaled abuse issues like malware and spam. And we do get complaints from people who feel like we've made the wrong decision in terms of deranking something or delisting something because they engage in spammy web search activity like link schemes or doorway domains, for example. On the other end of the spectrum, though, is something like YouTube. And so YouTube is a hosted platform. And we want to create a safe and vibrant community for our users. And we want to make sure that content that is illicit or illegal or dangerous isn't on that platform. So we don't allow content that promotes hatred, that incites violence, or that's pornographic. And it's really not only just to keep our users safe, but it's really a business imperative that we try to get it right. And the place in which you can find what our policies are the YouTube community guidelines. And those are publicly available. Not only do we provide the guidelines, but we provide tips and examples. So we can make it very clear to people that are posting videos what is likely to be violative of the community guidelines versus what might be fine. And the way that we help enforce those community guidelines, there's sort of multiple kinds of ways that we do that. One are automated flags, and automation, I think, is becoming increasingly important, especially given at the scale that we're operating. And so we have automated flags that are trained using machine learning that help us identify violative content. Now, once we get those automated flags, manual reviewers will then go back to make sure that the automated flags are actually being correct and what they're saying might be a community guideline violating video. But another useful part is that the manual reviewers can also look at those flags and help them retrain the machine learning flags so they're actually doing a better job and catching the right stuff and not wrongfully identifying anything. The second part are user flags. And so users can pretty easily click on a video and say, I think this violates your community guidelines. We'll review that and see whether that's true or not. And then finally, we have a program called our Trusted Flagger program. And this has really been an effective means at getting at content that might violate our guidelines. And so trusted flaggers are individuals or organizations that for whatever reason have expertise and interest in trying to identify content that violates our community guidelines. And this program has been really worthwhile. We provide these individuals and organizations with a more robust set of tools to identify the content, and we found that they tend to be 90% accurate, which is really amazing. And again, it's hard not to talk about us without talking about the kind of scale at which we're operating. So in our transparency report, we report quarterly statistics as of the last year or so about community guidelines violations and removals we've done as a result of those. And in Q2 of 2018, we removed something like 7.7 million videos for violating our community guidelines. 6.8 million of those flags were the result of automated flags. And again, those had human reviewers taking a look at them. 400,000 were just regular user flags, and I think 300,000 were trusted flaggers who were flagging those videos. But overall, during Q2, I think we got something like 37 million flags. And that related to something like 9.6 million videos being flagged by humans. So the numbers are pretty staggering overall. In one place in which the automated flagging part of it has been very useful is in identifying extremist content. So in 2017, we started having our machine learning classifiers trained on over 2 million videos that included extremist content. And since then, and in 2017, we found that about 70% of videos that included extremist content we were able to remove within 8 hours of upload, and almost 50% of those within 2 hours of upload. And something like 98% of the videos that we're identifying that include extremist content are ones that we are able to reach through the automated flagging program. So that's clearly a very key component of what we're doing. And as Peter noted for Facebook, our teams are working 24/7. They are trained in multiple languages so that we can quickly handle whatever the requests that we're getting in whatever language might be applicable. Obviously, YouTube isn't the only product we have. We have different policies for our different products. For Play, we have our developer program policies. We have various policies for our ads products. So it really runs the gamut, and there are different teams that are dedicated to those products. In terms of the overall amount of people that are working on these issues, if you include both legal removals as well as policy teams, I think in 2018 we'll have 10,000 people working on those issues. Those are human reviewers. Those are people that are working on the engineering side in terms of creating more automated flags and machine learning to assist us with this process. They also include additional tooling that we're trying to provide also to the content providers. So I think on YouTube, we've got different ways for channel owners to help them flag content like comments that might be inappropriate, just so that they have another means in their own toolkit to kind of figure out how to, deal with kind of content moderation issues. The teams, like I said, are engaged in a lot of training programs, which is incredibly important. But I think some of the real goals that we have are not only training and making sure that we're trying to get these things right, but also transparency. And transparency comes in the form of our publishing our policies, making it as clear as possible what our guidelines are, and those are helpful, I think, for the users. But also in terms of the reporting that we do through Lumen and through our own transparency report. We found that work is good for trying to explain what we're doing. These are obviously involving speech issues, so trying to be as transparent as possible is incredibly important. I think there's also just the fundamental nature that these statistics have actually seemed to be able to fuel research, and also instances like with the fake orders where we're better able to identify abuses of these kinds of systems. Not everyone agrees with the decisions that we do make, but we find that, hopefully the best way to work it out is with a person who disagrees, and, we always are looking to resolve things in a way that makes everyone happy. If that's not always possible, it's not always true that it's possible to do so, but we certainly endeavor to do so, and we have a lot of people that work really hard at that.
Yeah, thank you, Nora. That's terrific as well. Gerald?
Hey, everyone. I'm Jarrell. I'm on the trust. Can everyone hear me? I'm Jarrell. I'm on the trust and safety team at Twitter. I've been with Twitter for about 3.5 years working in trust and safety. I really want to thank Kate and the team for having me here. I am a newbie, as you heard, to this. Hello? Hey, so I said, when everyone hear me, everyone was like nodding. You all, like, I appreciate you're agreeable, but yes, thank you. I know who real friends are. So yes, I'm Jarrell Peterson. I work in trust and safety. I've been on Twitter for about 3.5 years. I want to thank the team for having me here. As I mentioned, I am a newbie, so I have my notes to make sure I'm covering the areas. I'm really passionate about this work. I can ramble on for hours, and so I'm going to use my notes to keep me honest. So if you see me flipping pages, because I want to make sure you get the right information from me, and I'm really excited about the questions that you all have, specifically coming from that first panel we heard. And so I'd like to share a little bit about my background and how I got to Twitter. I wouldn't say that I'm a tech bro. If you would ask me a couple years ago if I were working at Twitter, I would have told you no. I started my career in social work, and so I was doing advocacy with lots of vulnerable populations, anywhere from low-income families, people with severe mental illness, advocating for resources and support. And then I kind of switched gears to work on public policy. I kind of wanted to bridge what I saw happening on the ground, or what's happening in more macro systems and structures, because the people who are deciding what money, what rules, programs, policy affected my constituents never had to worry about healthcare or education or food or mental illness and those things. And so I thought I was going to change the world by bridging that gap. And that kind of led me to Twitter and meeting the team and seeing how passionate they were, and the fact that in doing this work, I get to be an advocate for vulnerable groups globally. I get to be a policy wonk. I get to leverage research, relationships, and technology to solve really complex issues. And I was surprised to find that there were so many other people at Twitter who are committed to just the exact same thing and really running towards the fire on these kinds of things. And really, as someone mentioned in the previous panel, like agonizing over these decisions to make sure we're getting it right and are things that we can actually defend on. And so that's a bit about me. And so I'll switch gears and I'll talk a bit about Twitter's purpose. We believe our purpose is to serve the public conversation. We believe our customers should be able to express their unique point of view on the platform, and it's a job of the trust and safety team to make sure that that's possible, that we can make that happen. I think a really interesting word in that sentence I just shared is unique. I learned really quickly that I may find myself in a room defending opinions or ideas and perspectives that I don't agree with as an individual, but we think it's important for it to be there on our service, for us to strike the balance between freedom of expression, but then also when it crosses the line into abuse. So when I talk a bit more about policy, there are some distinctions between our companies and others because they're used in different ways, and our approach does focus a bit more on behavior. We also allow a lot more content, but I'll talk about that in a second. And I just want to say, too, that we've seen increasingly over the past few years that safety has become a critical issue for us. From our CEO down, everyone knows that this is important for us to get it right and is working collaboratively to make this happen. I think if you think about the change between what we heard at the genesis of this work to kind of where we are now, is the work is inherently cross-functional. And that's my bread and butter. That's where I live, working with lots of stakeholders, translating complex information to get our engineers understanding the impact of the work, getting our marketing and sales teams understanding how safety is relevant to what they do. So what's really exciting for me is that it is inherently cross-functional. We're not doing policy development in a vacuum. We're working really closely with our public policy team, who are our eyes and ears on the ground. What's coming in legislation? What are the NGOs saying? We're working closely with our, what we call Twitter services, our enforcement arm, and thinking about what are the trends that we are seeing? How does that inform policy? What data should we be collecting, not just about these behaviors, but what areas where agents have the most confusion? How do we make sure agents are prepared? Should they be thought of as our customers as well? And from that perspective, I'll kind of move into policy. We have lots of policies that we've shipped. We've shipped over 30 new policies and products since 2017. We're creating lots of policies constantly. The policy development process is very similar to what we heard from Peter. We start with an idea that usually either comes from an NGO or nonprofit organization. It comes from our Twitter services team saying, here's a trend and a new behavior that we're seeing on the platform. It might be a gap or gray area. What we're also lucky enough is that Twitter is real time. Twitter is what's happening, is what people are talking about. And so we get that real time feedback whenever we mess up. I'm sure if you all have Twitter accounts, you have seen it. Our customers tell us when they don't like what we do. They tell us when they don't agree. And that feedback is incredibly helpful. And what I like to share externally is that we're listening and we're reading those things. You can bet that when you mention someone in our C-suite, that it's probably sent to me. And it's like, tell me more about this, And I think that real-time feedback is important. And lots of times people are like, oh, it's so critical, it's so negative, or even at deploy, it's like, it's so critical and negative. And I'm like, this is valuable. It's what we want to hear. We want to build understanding, we want to build transparency. And from a policy development perspective, we're taking all of those things into context, and then we kind of move into like a risk assessment. What is the risk of us not doing something or not having this policy? What is like the risk to speech? What is the risk to offline harm? What are some of the other behaviors we're seeing across the industry? We do lots of cross-industry working groups on things like mental health, right? We want to make sure we're keeping those things in mind. And then from there, we kind of create a plan of action. How can this be enforced at scale? How are our customers going to understand this? How are we going to explain it? What language should we use? And usually during that process, we loop in all of the other stakeholders for feedback. So we'll say, hey, public policy, what do you think about this? Does this make sense, right? I don't like to sit at my desk and assume that I know the entire experience of all of our customers globally as it relates to like the scale point. And so it's really helpful for us to get lots of different opinions globally in that process, as well as our enforcement arm, where it's like, hey, Jarrell, that policy is so great. I totally get what you want to do. We cannot enforce this. We can't teach our agents this, or there are tools limitations. And so we'll do that dance where we kind of scale back on not necessarily the pie in the sky, but what can we actually enforce, and what can we enforce consistently is how that process. And that process takes a while, doing that dance, getting to us to a much better place. Usually it starts with my big idea, and then we kind of transform it down. And then since then, we've been really transparent about this process. We've launched our safety center that talks about some of the NGOs and researchers and academics in our trust council who advise us on these things, that kind of talk through how we do our environmental scans, how we assess whether or not a new policy, like the life of a policy. We published all that information. We've also talked about our enforcement considerations, which I'll dive a bit more into later when we talk about content moderation, but in really thinking about how we are looking at behavior. I think one of the significant differences between us and other companies is that we don't have a hate speech policy. We have a hateful conduct or hateful behavior policy. And so we're trying our best to stay agnostic of what is happening or what is being said, but think about what is the behavior. Who is the target? Is it a group of people? Is it an individual? Have we heard from the target? Is it threatening? Is it abusive? Does it include slurs, other language? And we think that's important, given that we are serving the conversation, and we like people to be able to speak back to the kinds of things that are happening in the world. And again, that real-time nature, as things are coming out, it means a lot less when we, from our Twitter safety handle, say, this is what we think it is. It means a lot more from your faves who are verified, who are experts, to come out and say, actually, that's not true, flat earther. That's not like supported by science, right? And I think the perspective that I always bring and put in for the team is, we have to keep people at the center of this work. And there are, in my opinion, a lot less bad people than there are people who are thoughtless. And what we see on the platform, people are coming, sharing their opinions, and oftentimes you don't know you're misogynist. You don't know that you're racist or really problematic until someone tells you. Right? I thought I was super woke when I joined our team, and I thought I was sex positive and all of those things. No, the world is big, right? You find out from feminist Twitter, you find out from Black Twitter, you find out from science Twitter what's going on, and we rely on that, and we rely on our customers to course correct. That said, we are investing a lot more in when it crosses the line into abuse. So it's one thing for me to believe that the earth is flat and that kind of thing. It's another for someone to say that they hope that I should die because I believe that, right? And then target it at me. And that's what I mean when I say we're trying to be agnostic of the speech and more of this is a behavior and you have crossed the line. And that kind of takes me a bit into automation and what we've done related to behavior-based signals. And so by integrating behavior-based signals, we're able to surface the most quality content. We don't want to be taking things away because, again, everything is context dependent. We don't want to silence people, especially marginalized groups on our platform. But we want to make sure you see the best content first, or the content we think is most relevant to you based on the things you've told us about yourself. Unlike other companies, we don't really know a lot about you other than your behavior. We know what you like. We know what you often retweet and who you follow, and that's really it. We don't know your gender. We don't know your race. Some people, we don't know their birth date. We don't know where you're from, and we don't require you to share those things for us. And so we can't possibly integrate that into any of our work. But in areas like search and conversations where we get the most abuse reports, we've seen these behavior-based signals have an impact, and we're seeing a significant drop in abuse reports in search and a significant drop in abuse reports in conversations. For those who aren't following, conversations are basically just like replies to a tweet. We call that a conversation. That's often where we see the most abuse reports, because you are an increased likelihood of encountering someone who you don't follow or an opinion you don't agree with. And often when people disagree, it moves from dialogue to debate, especially as lots of people join. And so that was an important area for us to address, because we saw lots of people engaging in ways that require people to feel like they need to use block and mute and report. And so those kinds of surfaces we focus a lot of our behavior-based signals on. And the next part I want to talk about is just transparency. We've done a lot over the past year related to transparency, to not only in-app, but externally as well. As I mentioned before, we've updated our help center to try to be as clear as possible about what our rules are. We're trying to increase providing more examples there. We're at that fine line of like, how do you provide a concrete example of what is a violation of our hateful conduct policy, for example, without victimizing groups? We're actually working on that right now, trying to think about how you do that. We want people to really understand the behaviors and the conduct that we're talking about without making people feel like we're using them or their group as an education tool. Right, so there are challenges there, but we're moving in that direction. Try to be as clear as possible and collect feedback on it. A lot of the feedback we heard during our recent announcement regarding dehumanization and that policy was like, I get it, this makes a lot of sense, it's problematic. However, regardless of the decision that you make, if people don't understand what you're talking about, and these terms around mechanistic and all of that stuff mean nothing to the overwhelming majority of your customers, you need to be thinking about that as well. And I was like, oh, that hit my spirit, right? Like I totally know that from my background. And it's like, how do we solve that problem? Additionally, we've been trying to give more transparency in-app. So when you're in violation of our rules, we tell you why, we tell you the specific tweet, and then what behaviors you need to do in order to gain access to your account, as well as how to appeal the decision that we made. Because of the scale we operate, we know we're going to get it wrong, and so appeals become a really important process for us, and we're increasingly focusing on how do we add more context to appeals. And context is important context is everything for us. When an agent sees a tweet, even our best agents, they're still having to think about, well, is this a threat, right? Or is this a joke between friends? Or is this sports trash talk? Or is this gaming talk? Or is these song lyrics? How many times I've overturned an account because it was song lyrics, because they were threatening to kill somebody, and I'm like, that's the music you listen to, but I respect that speech. Very sorry we made a mistake. It's important for us to leverage our tools to make sure we're surfacing that appropriate context. And the transparency piece relates to that, because we don't want our customers to speculate. And what we see a lot on our platform is not Twitter took down this tweet because it violated their abusive behavior policy, because it wished harm on a target. What we see is Twitter took this down because I am a black trans person, right? Or Twitter took this down because they don't like conservatives, or they don't like liberals, or they don't like libertarians, or the Green Party. And I think we're not shooting for agreement in a lot of our work, but we are pushing for increased understanding of the decisions that we make and the complexity of this work. And so I'll transition quickly to our approach to content review. You've already heard from the other panelists. We take a similar approach. We know that if we were ever to automate the removal of content, it will result in significant false positives, and we do not want that. We don't think that creates or allows for good conversation. And so our automation usually surfaces content for review. And to that end, we've significantly expanded the amount of agents who are looking at these things. We have 24/7 coverage. We have coverage in all languages, or not all languages, the majority of languages that are spoken on our service. We also provide in-depth training to our agents around the rules and our policies and what those behaviors look like. Specifically as it relates to the context of some of our abusive behavior policies, one of the efforts I was excited to work on at Twitter is this idea of like our cultural abuse trends training. One of the questions I get often is, well, if a black person reports something, how about you have a black person review it? And I was like, yes, that sounds great on the surface. However, at the scale we operate, we cannot assume that we know the context, right? Like, I am black, you all see me, but I don't know what it means to be black in Japan, or what it means to be black in Brazil or Paris, right? And so I could not assume to have the context for reports that come from those regions. Instead, what we do is, in the spirit of putting our customers at the center, we make sure our agents have a in-depth understanding of what are the culturally relevant or context clues, if you will, that they can spot in a tweet to know if something is hateful conduct. For example, is this person being targeted because of their status or their membership in a protected category, right? What does that look like? What does targeting someone who's a refugee or perceived to be a refugee look like compared to targeting someone who you perceive to be a Muslim, right, or Jewish? They're different, and they look different on our platform, and we want agents to be able to identify that. And so a lot of that training goes with them too. And then again, the reminder that these are people, right? When we get a report, we do have bad faith reports, and that's a separate work stream for us, but the overwhelming majority of our customers are not bad actors. They are not bad faith reporters, and we want to remember that there are real world physical, emotional, psychological consequences to online abuse, as well as financial consequences, that is something we should be considering as well. And I think kind of going forward, while I wrap up, some of the things we are focused on is more automation. How do we surface more content, more context? How do we improve our tools so we can understand if this tweet that looks hateful and abusive on the surface is actually consensual communication between friends? I'm often really surprised at the hateful things that friends say to each other on our public service, right? I was like, I know you have a job. I know your boss can probably see this, but you said it to your friend. Trying to work with our tools so we can surface that context is really important for us so we can make the right decision. And then continue to push the needle on transparency and education, and not just being satisfied with putting all of our rules out there, but really assessing ourselves on how many of our customers actually understand what we mean and could identify an example of this behavior, and doing some of that translation work too. The example I provided, new friend who I was explaining earlier, comes from my dad, right? When you think about radical transparency. So I think about like the NASDAQ, right? We know exactly where all of the stocks are at any given moment, all day. You can watch that thing tick up and down and numbers. And to me, that literally means nothing. I am really excited about it, right? It makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate the transparency, but it's not until I listen to like Kai Ryssdal, on NPR, and he's like, well, actually it went down because Walmart sold 500 new yellow t-shirts or something like that. I'm like, oh, thank you. That makes a lot of sense, right? And I think that's where we want to push ourselves to get to, and also education along the life cycle. So not just letting you know that you're in violation of our rules when you violate them. You should probably know what our rules are as you join, or as you're tweeting, or as you're participating in a conversation that we think is toxic, right? Those are great opportunities, and we're exploring how we can do that better. Thank you.
Jarrell, that was terrific as well. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
If I can, I'm going to exercise the moderator's privilege and ask a question before I get to the queue. I think all of you have touched on it, but I'd like to pull forth one thread from your conversation. Every time that one of your organizations makes a policy rule, or actually applies a rule to a particular item of content, in a sense, you're making winners and losers. Someone's getting what they wanted, and someone else or some other groups of people are not getting what they want. And those losers are going to be pretty unhappy about the outcomes. Is that just part of the business and unavoidable, or are there things that you can do to better bridge the gap with the, quote, losers in those policy or content decisions to make them feel less unhappy about the consequences of your actions?
I can start. So we know we're not going to get agreement among all of our customers globally. Something we do internally with our employees is we kind of ask them really difficult questions we consider all the time, and have them kind of move themselves along a spectrum. And we can't even get agreement among like 20 or 30 people when we have them in a room. So we know for the 350 million people that we serve that we're not going to get agreement. That said, I think it's important for us to be transparent around the principles around our policy decisions and the clarity there. So even if people don't agree, they understand. And then beyond that, thinking about if you don't agree with our policy, how do you still have a really great experience on Twitter? And I'm always thinking about people at the center, and so I'm always thinking of my family and how they use Twitter and how I force them to use Twitter, so they give me really honest feedback about it. And there are some things that my mom, when she's on there, does not want to see or engage with. We have lots of people who are like, I want to speak truth to power. I want to engage and talk back to or disavow or disprove. But we also have lots of our customers come to our platform to share their favorite quotes from their vampire novels, AKA my mom. Like, that's what she likes. And there are some things that she'll report to us that are never going to be in violation of our policy. That said, we're a business. Our customers hire us every single day, and we should be thinking about how do we make sure that we give them the experience that they want. So if something's not in violation of our policy, can you use our quality filter, for example, to make sure you don't see this content again? Or, of course, there's block and mute, and there's lots of challenges with those for certain types of abusive behaviors, but making sure they have the tools to create the experience that they want. So it doesn't feel like because you don't agree with our policy or because our policy doesn't cover a specific issue that you're passionate about, that you lost. It's more like, here's what our policy, so you understand. Here are the ways that you can create the experience that you want on Twitter, so you can still get all the benefit from it without having to go private, for example.
Yeah, and I mean, I think similar to that, the transparency point is a really important one. Not only having the policies out there so you can review them, but also building it out with help center content and examples. So at least those people who feel like they didn't, what you call the losers or the people whose content can be removed can kind of get a better sense and maybe more of an explanation than just the policy itself as to why we're taking a different decision. And, for example, in our transparency report, we give a bunch of examples of instances in which we do decide to take down content versus those instances in which we don't decide to take down content. So again, that gives us some of the idea of like what we're wrestling with and what decisions we're making. And also, I mean, we do respond to users on our various platforms when they say, we don't think you made the right decision. And sometimes we change our minds. And so hopefully, knowing that gives some of the feeling that, even if your content has been removed, there's a reason why we did it. You have as much information so that when you, post the new video or, when something's on search, that you've got enough information so that you can kind of figure out like what the ground rules are.
Just 2 quick points from me. The academics that we talk with in this area emphasize the importance of process. If people think there's a fair process, they're going to have a much better perspective on the whole thing. And so, translating that into actual content and mechanisms is not necessarily easy, but I think it's safe to say that we're trying as best we can to learn from that. And the other thing is one point that Jarrell made about educating people and trying to make them aware of what we're doing is really important and not an easy nut to crack at all. I mean, once you get outside this room, we're constantly confronted with the fact that there are many, many, many thousands of our users who do not even know we have content policy standards. And so when they bump up against them, sure, it's going to be a bad experience. So trying to explain that, draw people's attention to that. I mean, we do education campaigns, but it's a continuous thing. And I think we need to think harder and learn from our competitors in some cases. Nora, I don't know if you worked on that, the YouTube video that shows the law enforcement report process, the one with like the Legos.
I didn't, but I think it's super cool.
It is
yeah.
really cool. It is really cool. So that's the kind of thing I think we need to do more of.
I'll take a question from the audience here. It says, conversations around policy often focus on the big three platforms represented on this panel, but every platform has its own policy standards. What platforms do you think are innovating in the policy space? Where do you look for policy inspiration outside of your platform?
I guess I would say that we definitely keep a close eye on what our colleagues are doing here, and we regularly learn from them, and try to take on board the best possible lessons from that. We definitely talk to smaller companies, in the counterterrorism space. There's been a lot of activity there. There's actually a forum for that. I think much of that is them learning from us, but obviously where we are able to learn from them, that's valuable, and we try to do that.
Yeah, I think the same. I mean, obviously we look to each other. There are trends that happen in this field, and we try to pay attention to those. I guess the other thing is that we're mindful of the fact that we have a lot of resources and that smaller companies don't necessarily have those. So to the extent that we can assist with a company that can't have thousands of employees working on it, hopefully the amount of things that we have publicly available about what we do and how we do it can be useful.
I would just echo that, and just the big plus one. I think for us, we're of course looking at our colleagues in the space, because some of the issues that we deal with are unique to us because of the scale at which we operate and the purpose of our service. That said, we do provide a lot of education and support to smaller companies as they're growing, and helping them think about how they should start thinking about these from the beginning and not when they get to our size and then it's like too late, So really trying to get them prioritize that early, and then also get our customers thinking about the difference. One of the things I recognize is that lots of people who have Twitter on their phone probably have Facebook and probably have Google or lots of other things, and Tumblr. And I think they assume that we're all the same people writing the policies for the things, and we're not. And we all have different resources, and there's different ways to use it. And so I think it's important too for our customers to understand that as well. Lots of times we'll say, oh, this company took it down, how come you didn't? Twitter. And it's like, different behaviors, different platform, different resources, but how do we start having that conversation in a productive way so it doesn't feel like you're losers, as the word was used before, but it's more like really understanding what people are getting themselves into by having these accounts, by sharing their information and what's important to them in these different ways.
I'm going to take another question from the audience. It says, can you talk a bit about the difficulty of content moderation, particularly with political speech?
I'll start again, rookie. It's incredibly difficult. So we want people to be able to express themselves freely on our platform, right? I think the challenge as it relates to political speech is lots of times we see people coming to Twitter sharing their beliefs in a way that's supposed to speak truth to power. And then we have this gray area of what we call trash to power. And so it makes a really, really great point and statement, and there is data to back it up, and they cite an article or something, and then it has a bunch of slurs in it, right? And then it has that wish of harm we see a lot, and it's like, and I hope you die, and I might just come get you later on tonight. And it's those gray areas we have that challenge. It's like we want people to be able to speak back and say these kinds of things, but what do we do in that moment when this person is in violation of our policies and in making their point? And so we're always trying to find that balance too. I think increasingly we, on the transparency front, could be better about explaining externally the decisions that we make. And so, as I mentioned, we'll grapple with an example like the one I just gave you, and we'll make a principled decision that we can defend, but then our customers or people who are looking at this tweet are like, this is clearly a violation of Twitter policy because it has a wish of harm. That's abusive behavior. How come we're not taking it down? Thinking about what we could say there where it's like some kind of interstitial, like, hey, heads up, this may be in violation of our policy. We think it's important because it's of public interest, right? I think our new ways that we're thinking about approaching this, in the same vein that we do with other sensitive media, right? So compared to lots of our partners in the space, we allow pornography, for example, but we take lots of different steps to make sure that if that's not what you're looking for, you're probably not going to find it on our platform. I'm surprised at how many of our internal employees don't even know that we allow pornography on our platform. But we also do it in a way that we try to keep it safe, and we try to be transparent. Like, hey, you might encounter something that's sensitive. This is what we think it could be. Are you sure you want to see this? Kinds of things. So trying to thread that needle between addressing this without silencing speech, being really transparent around the principled decisions we're making about the things we leave up to minimize speculation and confusion, and then also apply our policies consistently and fairly.
Yeah, and I think I'd say something very similar, which is, we're aware of and proud that people use our platforms for political speech. That's incredibly important. I talked about how, we have to strike the right balance when it comes to it. And we're really pleased that, speech from all different kinds of viewpoints are on our platforms. So again, we, apply our policies, which don't take into account those viewpoints, and try to apply them consistently.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different directions you could go with that. It's hard to know where to begin. I mean, the issue of political speech as a signal for content that may be charged or potentially polarizing threads its way through a lot of our determinations. I mean, there's a huge amount of activity now at the company around election integrity. It's just super, super important. And I think there's also a sense in which political content becomes a relevant consideration when content doesn't violate our policies but is alleged to violate local law. That's something that we also would take into account in the process that we undertake, which is similar to what Nora was discussing in trying to determine whether to geo-block a piece of content.
We've already taken up a bit of your lunchtime here, so I think we're going to call it quits there. Again, want to say thanks to the speakers for participating in this panel. As I mentioned, there's high interest here, and it's really grateful for them that they can share it. Kate, do you have any instructions about lunch?